Okay, Dennis, thanks so much to you for the invitation. I was really surprised and I had to accept. Thanks a hell of a lot. I'd like to thank the organizing committee. I'd like to thank Annette for your meticulous attention to making everything run smoothly. And I'd also like to thank Rory for being a gracious host. And thanks to Anton, who I haven't met yet, but for allowing us to use this magnificent home. And for the generous people that sponsored this occasion. Thanks very much. The name will become apparent a bit later in the talk, but Kabbo is a person, a San healer. And kwaiń is the name of the indigenous name for the plant we're going to talk about, Sceletium tortuosum. And basically this has been a passion of mine for many years, and I'll explain why. So when I'd finished medical school, I'd done a degree in botany before I studied medicine. And I had this incredible tension between my two interests, one in medicine and one in botany. And in my final year of medicine, I actually wrote to Richard Evans Schultes to say I'm interested in studying psychoactive plants, etc. And he wrote back. I was surprised to get a letter back from him, in fact, and he wrote back really encouraging me. So after my internship, I took a gap year, traveled around, and wondered what to do. Did the usual circuit, Sri Lanka, Nepal, India, etc. In Nepal, I took some psilocybin mushrooms, and that kind of pushed me into a different direction. So when I came back to South Africa, I went to work in a rural hospital to have access to nature and also to serve the local people. During that time, I realized that all my patients, African patients, the hospital was about 100 kilometers from the Zimbabwe border, and we were serving Shangaan and Venda people. But all of my patients were seeing traditional healers at the same time. So I decided to meet the various traditional healers and find out who's who, which people were regarded as being more talented. And this talk is really dedicated to Chindani Maswanganyi, who's a healer that I worked with for many years as a doctor. I would go and see him after work, see him on weekends, and kept up a relationship with him for some years. And to give you some insight, apart from seeing that he had a wide spectrum of pharmacologically active plants, there was a whole other story going on with traditional rituals. He was the local psychologist, psychiatrist, and social worker. So, for example, I would discharge a patient that had been suffering from tuberculosis. The treatment was finished and he was discharged to go home. And I was very surprised to see the patient waiting to see Chindani on Saturday morning when I went to see him myself. And the thing is that from a traditional perspective, Western medicine had treated the bug, but it hadn't treated the reason why he got the tuberculosis in the first place. So this would be interpreted from a traditional perspective. And a ritual would be done, a ritual cleansing basically, to appease the ancestors if that was the problem, etc. But I also realized it was another story behind that, because there was a big ceremony to reintegrate him into the community, because TB is a stigma disease in African society. And for him to be accepted back, an announcement basically had to be made, a traditional announcement that this person has actually been cleansed of the stigma of the disease. So a couple of years ago, the second photograph, I went to find him. I was surprised. I was very happy he was still alive. And I took my children, who are now 18 and 20 respectively, to introduce them to Chindani. So that's the long relationship and the basic story of how I got involved in plants. So basically, I've divided the talk into 4 parts, going back into history. I don't want to bore you too much with the history, so I've just abstracted some interesting elements that you won't have been aware of. And a more definitive history will be in the paper of the talk. And then I'll speak about the development of a standardized, commercialized extract of Sceletium, a bit about the clinical research on it, and then a little bit about the future of Kanna. Now, I'm hoping there's such a small group here, and it's probably the first time many of you will have heard about Kanna. So what I'll try and do is leave some time at least to answer some questions, because I might not have covered everything, or you might be curious about some aspect I haven't dealt with. So the plant family is a succulent family, the mesembrine-alkaloids. The genus is Sceletium. In fact, it's been changed back. It used to be the genus Mesembrine-alkaloids. It was then changed back to Sceletium, and now it's back to Mesembrine-alkaloids, but I'll stick to Sceletium for the talk. And the genus name is named after the skeletonized lower leaves of the dried lower leaves. So you can see there's sort of a net vein readily apparent, skeletonized appearance. There's probably 9 species of Sceletium, but some of them may be species complexes, especially Sceletium tortuosum, the plant that I've been working with. The folk names are Kanna, either spelled with a K or a C. The Afrikaans word is kougoed, which means chewing stuff, and the Afrikaans was derived from the Dutch kougoed or kougoed, which preceded the Afrikaans. Okay. So if you can just remember the names, obviously Kanna is the feature of the talk, Sceletium, Zembrin is the name of the standardized extract we made. The Zembrin comes from the mesembrine-alkaloids. Okay. The plant has quite a broad distribution across 3 semi-arid provinces in South Africa, from the Northern Province, from the Northern Cape Province, Western Cape, Eastern Cape. And if you look at the Google Maps photograph, I've highlighted 2 areas. The one is called kougoed vlakte, because these are the only areas where historically the plant grew in any abundance. And kougoed vlakte means the chewing stuff flats, the plains of chewing stuff. And then the second arrow down below is an area called Kannaland, which is still to this day marked as a municipal area, the municipal area of Kannaland, the land of Kanna. And some anthropologists have proposed that there were powerful Khoi kingdoms revolving entirely around the trade in Kanna from Kannaland. Now, as I became more interested in this, we went to these remote areas. It's absolutely breathtaking. Most of the talks have been around Amazon forest plants, but I find these arid areas absolutely fascinating botanically, ethnobotanically. So this is the classical kind of environment in the Richtersveld of South Africa where Kanna grows. You see a beautiful tree, Aloe-dichotoma, some euphorbias, that's Euphorbia virosa. But Kanna will be scattered around here, tiny little green bushes here and there. So once I took an interest in it, I realized you could never do anything with this medicine because you can't wild harvest a plant like this. You'd have to learn to cultivate it. From the historical point of view, I mean, Google books are absolutely fantastic because they've scanned in so many books that you can actually search for particular words. So if you search the term Kanna or Kanna with a K, you'll find some interesting stuff. The earliest record I found was from 1610, where a ship docked in Cape Town Harbour. The ship was called the Globe, captained by a Captain Hippon. And this is an absolutely fascinating and probably the first report on the use of Kanna. They said, during this time we used great diligence in seeking the root ningam, and that's an old Japanese word actually for ginseng, according to our instruction, and the aforesaid 2 Holland ships being expressly come thither for the same purpose. So 2 Dutch ships had come specifically to find this root. And it's being one of Japan that first discovered the secret. So a Japanese sailor or traveler had picked up that this root is similar or the same as ginseng. And the right time of gathering the same being in December, January, and February, and is being called by the inhabitants Kanna. So from 1610, that's the first record that we think is Sceletium, but and it's most likely to be. In 1615 at Saldanha Bay, this is about 100 kilometers north of Cape Town, pretty much the same thing. The country people brought us down of the root Ningam, whereby we bought a handful, etc. And they didn't get enough because it wasn't the right season. And there's a footnote on the side of the book, Ningen, a medicinal root much prized in Japan. So it looks like the roots of Kanna were being traded by these ships either deliberately as an adulterant of ginseng or mistakenly believed to be a Cape ginseng. The one record that we really can associate with Sceletium is an expedition by the Dutch in the year 1685 up to Namaqualand in the northwest of the country. You can see the route the expedition tracked on the west coast. And they kept fantastic records, and they had an artist on the expedition. And it was more a campaign than an expedition, because it was a commander, 56 people of mostly European descent, 46 people of mixed ancestry, a number of translators, a carriage, 7 wagons, 8 carts, a boat for crossing rivers, a navigator, a mineralogist, an apothecary, and artist. And the purpose of that expedition was actually to go and look for the source of copper, because the indigenous Nama people wore copper earrings and had some copper necklaces and so on. And the Dutch thought if they could find the area where this is mined, it could be a profitable undertaking. 2 or 3 expeditions previously had failed. They needed to cross serious mountains, etc. But Heinrich Claudius, the artist on the expedition, painted beautiful paintings of the flora they encountered. And the subsidiary purpose of the expedition was to document anything that could be useful to the Dutch, including edible and medicinal plants. So this is the first formal painting, and it's the best thing we've got in lieu of a voucher specimen. So from the year 1685, they painted Sceletium. You can see Claudius even painted the skeletonized lower leaves. So there's absolutely no doubt it's the genus Sceletium. This plant is found with the Namaquas, that's the Namaqua people, only on some of their mountains. It's gathered in October and it's called Kanna. Now there's a copy of this journal that was done within about 3 years of this, with paintings that had been copied from Claudius as they're slightly cruder paintings. But it's interesting that in that version they spelled Kanna with a K. It's held by them and the surrounding tribes in as great esteem as the beetle or areca with the Indians. They chew the stem and the roots mostly all day and become intoxicated by it. So on the account of this effect and its fragrance and hearty taste, one could expect some profit from its cultivation, and it's found on the 20th of October. A Jesuit missionary stopped off and spoke about an indigenous captain or a tribal chief, pleased with his gift, sent us in gratitude 2 fat-tailed sheep. Those are indigenous sheep with a large vessel of milk, etc., and a certain herb which they called Kanna. And it's apparently this famous plant that the Chinese called ginseng. So again, the confusion between Kanna roots and ginseng. In 1726, the Dutch minister said the Kanna of the Hottentots closely resembles the Chinese root nisi or ginseng. So now we're starting to see a separation of the two. And this is a quote that's quite famous about Sceletium or Kanna. There's a root gathered by the Hottentots. Hottentots is a former derogatory term for Nama people. It's called Kanna, and it's held in such great esteem for its great virtues that they almost adore it. What greatly inflames the value of the root is its scarcity, for it's very rarely found. Now, something's changed from the historical times when it seemed to have been an abundant trade item, and now it's very rarely found. They look upon it as the greatest cheerer of the spirits and the greatest and the noblest restorative in the world. A restorative is a tonic. I've often seen the effects of Kanna upon Hottentots. They chew it, they retain it in their mouth a considerable time. but taking generally too much at a time, it drowns them in intoxications. Here we get the separation completely. The Kanna of the Hottentots is entirely different from ginseng. I've seen both and they're entirely different. They harvest the root in the months of November and December, which they still do, by the way, to this day. They add some water, put some honey in it, and leave it in the rocks to ferment. They drink it while it lasts, abruptly unable to do anything. And up to 1856, the confusion with ginseng persisted. Here's a French-English dictionary from that time. If you look up Kanna, it says a species of ginseng, Kanna. This is the Great London Exhibition of 1851, and I think that this is the most important moment in Kanna being exposed to the world beyond this limited trade between the Cape and Japan. So in 1851, a batch of plants used by the colonists in the Cape were exhibited at the Great London Exhibition. That exhibition had 6 million visitors, and most of them would have been professional people of one sort or another, engineers, scientists, chemists, etc. And the German botanist and physician Pape wrote the commentary that accompanied this collection. And one of the plants was Sceletium tortuosum, and here using the name mesembrine-alkaloids tortuosum. And his entry for this species is a native of the Karoo. This is one of these arid areas. It appears to possess narcotic properties. So we've had intoxication, now narcotic. And the Hottentots, who know it by the name kougoed, so he's used the Dutch name, are in the habit of chewing it and becoming intoxicated, while the farmers use it in the form of a decoction or tincture as a good sedative. So if you look back on these records, there's almost a dichotomy between how the Western people see it, that, well, we can use it usefully as a tincture, etc., but the indigenous people are just getting intoxicated by it. The first time we have the voice of the San people themselves is from these fantastic archives, the Bleek and Lloyd archives of the San people. A German philologist, Wilhelm Bleek, and his sister-in-law, Lucy Lloyd, documented meticulously the language. They understood the language, they documented the mythology, etc., of San people. They documented notes that accompanied pictures that the San painted. The people they worked with were in fact prisoners from the Breakwater prison in Cape Town, and they got permission to host these people in their house, developed relationships with them. Their families, the families of the San people, came to live in the house. And these archives are now available online through the hard work of Professor Pippa Scottness from the Michaelis School of Art at the University of Cape Town, and she's the director of the Center of Curating the Archive. So here we have a fantastic note. No one's picked up on this before, that they're actually talking about Sceletium. So the Bleek and Lloyd archives, no one's identified which plants were mentioned until now, where I found this word kougoed had been written into one of the archives. So for the first time we have the San name, kwaiń, the person who was the informant, Kassin. This is in Lucy Lloyd's meticulous handwriting. If a little child that's being suckled, a breastfeeding child, is ill inside, they take a piece of it, put it in a spoon of cold water, etc. The water becomes yellow and they give it to the child to drink. They do this to this day in Namaqualand. In fact, they use breast milk instead of water, and they give it to infants with colic. And now the title of the talk was Kabbo. So this is Kabbo's entry, which is not in the Bleek and Lloyd online archives, but in a separate archive. It is quite difficult to find this entry. But it's by Bleek himself, totally different handwriting. But the commonality is using the word kougoed. But we even have a photograph from that time of the informant, of Kabbo. They took some photographs of the informant and even did some nice watercolor paintings of them. And here's Kabbo's entry: a small plant found on the great mountains growing out of crevices in the rocks, just like that spot you saw before. It's chewed by bushmen. It gives strength to their limbs. It takes away, the word looks like pain, or at least I'm projecting that the word looks like pain, and makes their memory strong. That's a really interesting anecdote to me. The two bushmen from Steelmansfontein, that's a remote place, had some with them to enable them to walk until they met the wagon. So my interpretation of this is we're hearing something completely different. We're hearing more like an adaptogenic kind of activity than this intoxicant, narcotic type activity. And that kind of fits in with the ginseng-like activity of the roots. And lo and behold, somewhere about 20 odd years after the Great London Exhibition, it seems that kougoed or Kanna was actually exported to the United States, because I found two entries in botanical handbooks from the United States, completely separate. A botanical handbook of crude vegetable drugs, etc., in common use. So it was a handbook for apothecaries and pharmacists, and there's an entry for Sceletium under the name mesembrine-alkaloids, tortuosum, and just the use narcotic. And in 1895, a botanical ready reference saying the same thing. And that's the end of it. No more information from the United States. So we've got more than 3 centuries of records. We have identified the indigenous knowledge holders, so the San people and the Nama or Namakwa people. More than one species of Sceletiums used, different plant parts from the roots to the whole plant, etc. The methods of preparation, high value, traded locally, possibly internationally, ginseng-like, seems to become scarce. Use in infants, women and children, diverse actions, maybe sedative, hypnotic, analgesic, etc., enhances physical performance and memory. So this all intrigued me, and I decided to go into it deeper and do my own ethnobotanical research. This was almost 20 years ago. My wife, Olga, is actually a psychiatrist. My little girl, Kia, is 3 months old. And there are not many women, so I must really thank my wife in this talk, who would be prepared to go and sit in the middle of winter in Namakwa land with a 3-month-old baby. And that's my son, Eric. So we followed the Dutch expedition, went to the various places that you can find very easily because the Dutch did beautiful map work, stopped off where they went. And there's somewhere in the region of 40 to 50 plants that were painted for this expedition. We can find the plants in the same places they found them. And lo and behold, local people are still using the plants in the same way. This is a pelargonium, and the roots eaten as a snack. Finally, you get to the Copper Mountains. They're still tinged with copper, and you can even find holes where the Dutch blasted shafts using gunpowder, and they smelted and did assays on the copper on the spot. And I'd just like to raise this note that people don't realize there's also something called indigenous geology, ethnogeology, because this area was too far away logistically for the Dutch to exploit. There wasn't a port close enough, and they couldn't send wagon loads of ore down to Cape Town, and there's no fuel, firewood, to do the smelting on site, so they eventually abandoned the idea. However, in the 1970s, the world's richest copper mines were right here on the spot, and that copper was discovered by the indigenous people. So back to Kanna. We certainly found it, met traditional healers that were using it, including these two, Yap Klase on the left and Gert Dirks on the right. Very interesting anecdotes, used to treat alcoholics and sometimes used for intoxication, and they used the word onze droë drank, our dry alcohol. No hallucinations. I went over and over. In fact, I was disappointed because I was looking for a psychedelic plant from South Africa, and I was hoping it was going to be Kanna, but it wasn't. But Gert Dirks gave me this interesting anecdote. He says it opens the mind, and he used this type of a gesture. He's the only person I got this type of information from. It's used by men and women. It's used for sleep. It's used for asthma, constipation, pain, toothache, and no severe adverse effects are known, including in infants. And they said they sometimes overdose the infant because it's quite a potent plant. And I said, well, what happens then? Oh, nothing. The child just sleeps for longer. Nothing had ever happened to the kids. We also interviewed women They used it in pregnancy, so that's very interesting if you're wanting to think about the safety point of view. Is the thing possibly teratogenic, etc.? They use it in pregnancy, they use it in childbirth for pain, they use it during breastfeeding, they gave it to the kids for colic, and just for an overall sense of well-being. And that became a consistent theme, that lower doses were actually consistently used on a regular daily basis just for a sense of well-being. And just a note, this kid looks cute, but if you look a little bit closer, he looks miserable. And I realized while I was interviewing the mom that the child was breathing fast, and I realized that he actually had bronchopneumonia. So we had to abandon this trip, take the mom and the child to a hospital about 100 kilometers away. But it's a nice thing being a doctor, even if I'm a bit out of practice, because you can also make a contribution to communities from time to time. The other interesting participants were shepherds. The goats and sheep have to roam over enormous areas because there's very limited feed for them. And people still build these traditional huts like they did for the last 1,000 years at outhouses. And obviously they've got an intimate knowledge of the succulent flora in the area. So what did the shepherds say? Like this guy, his name is Ludovic Morris. There he is just crushing up some Sceletium, Kanna, to use on the spot. They use it to feel comfortable when walking long distances. They use it not to take away hunger or thirst, but to feel comfortable with being hungry or thirsty. It's quite a different thing. Fermentation potentiates the trek or high. They use the word trek, which is in fact a Dutch word or Afrikaans word, to make you high. Baking is another way of doing it. They said if you haven't got 8 days to ferment stuff, you can just build a fire, scrape it away, put the plant in the hot coals, and leave it to bake for an hour. So that obviously shifts the chemistry in some way. Dokter, jy moet leer hoe om dit te gebruik, because I started chewing it and he stopped me and he said, you've got to learn how to use it. If you're going to chew too much and then you're going to get a big rush out of it, you've got to take small amounts of the plant. That's the way it's used. So that's interesting, and low doses are used for well-being. In some cases, we interviewed people that had been using it every single day for the last 4 decades of their life. So that was an interesting thing. I was interviewing elderly men and realizing they seemed, and I made notes at the time, they seemed more lucid than typically you find in elderly people in these remote rural areas. Usually they're very slowed down, they've had poor nutrition, etc. The kougoed chewers were lucid, and I'll show you one now. Then I think a fundamentally important part of the expedition for me was, here we've got something that's clearly psychoactive, but is it going to be addictive? Are you going to do a whole bunch of research and find you're going to introduce a new drug of addiction into society? So from the traditional healers, from my own ethnobotany, I thought, well, it's non-addictive, there's no dependence, etc. But I decided to take a friend of mine, Greg McCarthy, who was a psychiatrist, academic psychiatrist specializing in addiction. He was South Africa's leading addictionologist at the time. And sadly, Greg passed away last year, still working in addiction, but he'd emigrated to Canada. So what Greg did is he took the DSM-3 criteria for addiction and developed a questionnaire, and we interviewed all sorts of elderly men and women in the communities. And the conclusion was there was no dependence, no tolerance, no withdrawal, and there were no socially dysfunctional Kanna users in the community. You can see this elderly guy here who's actually chewing the Sceletium while we were interviewing him, and what they do is they chew a wad of it like chewing tobacco, and after a few minutes they take it out of their mouth and they put it into the hat band to dry out. And they're just taking a very subtle dose, and after something like 4 or 5 hours they'll take it out and chew it again. So they're just cruising in a nice, smooth way. And I must tell you, the Namaqualanders are the friendliest, nicest people you can ever wish to meet. And I think Annette may know if she's traveled in these areas. Yeah. So if we look into the chemistry, it's been very well described in the literature. These are mesembrine-alkaloids, basically dimethoxyphenolic on an indole skeleton. Key alkaloids, there are hundreds of alkaloids that are related, but the key ones really are mesembrine, mesembrinone, mesembrinol, mesembrinol. The problem is when we assayed plants, some would have almost no alkaloids, some would be very high. In fact, we even found plants up to around 3% alkaloids. And any of these individual alkaloids could be either zero of the relative composition or 90% of it. So again, you go back to indigenous knowledge, and the indigenous people would say to us, listen, if you want to get intoxicated, you must take those. That's the trek variety, and it's the same species. And then they'd say, but if you go over there, that's the muck variety, which is the tame variety for everyday use. So again, indigenous people have played an intimate role in this whole project. And of course, when we mapped the whole chemistry, we could see the different communities. And there's some sympatric distribution where there's an overlap of chemotypes. And I think at the moment there are DNA studies underway, and we'll find out whether Sceletium tortuosum, for example, is a single species or a species complex. So commercially, we developed a standardized extract. This is the fingerprint of it. It's completely reproducible. It's standardized to 0.4% total alkaloids by dry weight. The mesembrinol and mesembrinone are 80% of the alkaloid composition, the relative composition. Mesembrinol must just be present as in the fingerprint, and mesembrine we keep low. And mesembrine seems to be responsible mainly for this high. I found a company in Spain, it's now been renamed Nectium, as a company that could extract something to an incredibly high standard, EU GMP registered with fantastic chemists, etc. And my intention at the time, I wanted to develop Kanna, standardized Kanna extract into a modern botanical medicine, a botanical drug, a botanical phytomedicine. That dream, unfortunately, hasn't been realized, but we'll get there. I now work for Nectium. I mean, after all this work with Sceletium, I got to know them, and now I head up I'm the director of science for the company. We did the usual, looking at something like 90 CNS targets for Zembrin, the extract of Sceletium, and individual alkaloids. Once we got hits, where we defined it loosely as more than 50% inhibition of the radioligand binding, we then did the functional screening. And lo and behold, only 2 activities in all the screening looked like they would be operating on a physiological level when you're taking these low doses of Kanna. And that would be inhibition of your 5-HT transporter, serotonin reuptake inhibition, Prozac-like activity, and phosphodiesterase 4 inhibition, enzyme inhibition. And the individual compounds clearly have different activities on these targets. Mesembrine is an extremely potent serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The Ki inhibitory constant is 1.4 nanomolar. And you'll see that mesembrinone is the more potent on PDE4 inhibition at an IC50 of 0.47 micromolar. And a pharmaceutical PDE4 inhibitor, Rolipram, is only about 4 times more potent than mesembrinone. So it was the first time mesembrinone we discovered was in fact a significant PDE4 inhibitor. I won't go into this. Everyone knows what a serotonin reuptake inhibitor is. It's Prozac-like. Both Zembrin, mesembrine, and mesembrinone to a lesser extent are SSRIs, or SRIs, I would guess. And Zembrin itself and mesembrinone inhibit your phosphodiesterase enzyme, which prevents the breakdown of cyclic AMP, ultimately going through the second messenger system to increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, etc. A great deal of work was done on Rolipram, which is your archetypal PDE4 inhibitor. And Rolipram had antidepressant activity, anxiolytic, anti-inflammatory, it's cognitive function enhancing, and it's implicated in neurogenesis. Rolipram was originally launched as an antidepressant in the 90s and was eventually taken off the market because of vomiting side effects. And what we found is that the mesembrine-alkaloids don't have this emetic activity. As far back as 95, we started learning to grow this as a crop. It's taken forever to learn to do it on a commercial scale, selecting the right chemotypes, etc. But this is where we are now, able to grow it under shade house conditions and even on a very large scale in open lands. And another beautiful aspect when you're actually producing it, apart from having the vertical integration and control of the chemistry of the plant, there's job creation in underserved rural areas. And I'd just like at this time to remember to thank the company H.L. Hall & Sons, who've been the major backers, financial backers of this project. An important and fundamental aspect of the project's benefit sharing. I mean, you've heard how we've identified not only the plant, but actually the specific chemotypes through these traditional healers and etc. So we negotiated a prior informed consent benefit sharing agreement with the South African Sand Council. And the Minister of Environmental Affairs had a big celebration because they awarded us the first ever bioprospecting and export permit for a South African plant. So it was done ceremonially with the permit 0001 in an antelope horn. And it was very sweet. The minister actually arranged for the two healers that I'd worked with to come to the ceremony. And so the communities were very happy to get the recognition. And unfortunately, Oom passed away a month after this celebration. Now, the prior informed consent is an important thing. Informed consent means that the indigenous people have to have some kind of knowledge about what you're doing. So what we did is we engaged through them a human rights attorney, an internationally renowned human rights attorney, to represent them in the negotiations with us. And we were very happy that that process went smoothly. It took about a year. And we finally signed the agreement. The trouble is the Sand people that the agreement was through were admittedly the first people to use Sceletium. And even in our indigenous knowledge, the Nama people said to us, the Sand mothers taught us how to use the plant. Okay. So I told the Sand Council, I said, look, we're happy to sign the agreement. We recognize that you're the primary knowledge holders, but we've got a responsibility to these two communities because this is where we did all the work. Took 2 minutes. They said, no problem. They can share 50%. So all the royalties that we pay the Sand Council through a government department actually does get split 50% to these two hamlets where I worked. And we have regular feedbacks. That's the last one I went to, was in 2014 with them. So in vivo, we found, I'm not going to spend too much time on the studies, we found that there was a restraint-induced stress releasing activity of quite high doses, 20 micrograms per kilogram of the alkaloids. We looked at brain electrical activity in vivo. These are all published papers, and they'll be nicely presented to you in the paper. And we found that there's dose-dependent activity attenuating most of these frequency ranges. And in this particular model, this is a classical stimulant signature, not a sedative signature, a central nervous system signature. And the electropharmacograms were similar to two botanicals, ginkgo and rhodiola. Interesting, rhodiola is an adaptogen, but also similar to rolipram, the PDE4 inhibitor, as the pharmaceutical that it was closest to in this particular study. So the clear translational applications that we could see would be for stress, anxiety, depression, cognitive function. We did formal preclinical toxicology, and the maximum tolerated dose was 5,000 milligrams per kilogram of the plant extract. I like to put down the alkaloids because ultimately we have to talk about the alkaloids in Sceletium. It's meaningless to say, 5,000 milligrams of an extract. You have to know what you're dealing with. And we did a 90-day repeat dose study, and again, it seemed incredibly safe. I mean, the human dose is only around 1.4 to 2.8 micrograms per day. the alkaloids. So there were no problems. Then we went into pilot clinical studies, and I'd just like to say these are pilot studies, they're look-see studies, they're not definitive large-scale trials. So we looked at safety and tolerability with Professor Haylene Null. We looked at cognitive function with Professor Simon Chu. We looked at a pharmacofunctional MRI with Professor Dan Stein. And we looked at EEG and psychometric tests, etc., with Professor Dimfel. The plant extract at 2 doses, we took very cautious in the beginning. We did 8 milligrams of the extract a day and 25 milligrams compared to placebo. These are all randomized placebo-controlled trials. 3-month study, absolutely no problem. But in the side effect diaries, it was the first time that Professor Null has seen people writing positive side effects in the patient diaries, saying, and we turned out mostly the people taking 25 milligrams saying, well, you know, I had a sense of well-being, I was less stressed, and this type of stuff. Better sleep at night. We did the first ever pharmacofunctional MRI scan on Sceletium through Professor Dan Stein. And what we found was there was reduced reactivity of the amygdala to fear-inducing images under low perceptual load conditions. In other words, when a person is doing sort of very minor things and they're presented with an angry face and they take 25 milligrams of Zembrin, there's less reaction to that in your amygdala. But the interesting thing is this is only a single dose compared to placebo, and the scan was done 20 minutes after the single dose. So it has a very rapid onset of action. And similarly, we found that there was an attenuation of the reactivity between your amygdala and hypothalamus. So the conclusion is not that Zembrin is an anxiolytic, but it has anxiolytic potential. And I was very proud that this paper was published in the journal Neuropsychopharmacology, which is a Nature stable journal. So it was a great bunch of academics to work with. Professor Simon Chu looked at the effects of Zembrin, again randomized placebo-controlled trial in an older age group, the average of 54 years old. 3-week study, basically using a CNS vital signs, a computerized battery of tests. And out of the 8, 2 were statistically significant results, improved executive function, which is quite nice. And we're seeing that, by the way, around exam time in South Africa, the pharmacies closest to the universities and schools, the sales of Zembrin-containing products ticks up, and improved cognitive set flexibility. So this is just starting to see that there may be a cognitive enhancing activity, but it's not defined yet. The latest one, this was published 2017, the effect of Zembrin on EEG, psychometric tests and Hamilton Anxiety Scale. And to cut a long story short, the most exciting part, because this was a 6-week study, 2 different doses of Zembrin compared to placebo. But on the last day of the study, the patients didn't take a Zembrin. They did all the tests before, so it's basically the residual effect either of the previous day's Zembrin or the previous 6 weeks of Zembrin, not the acute effect. And the Hamilton Anxiety Rating Scale score for the 50 milligram dose of Zembrin significantly improved. If we can reproduce this, this is quite dramatic because these are healthy people. And typically, if you're looking for an anxiolytic activity, I mean, as psychiatrists here, present here know, multinationals fail unless they study extreme disease, generalized anxiety disorder in large numbers of people, and typically in a multi-center trial. So this might be the first hint, and it fits in with the in vitro mechanisms of action we've got, but let's verify this in the future. So what is the future of these, of the plant itself and the alkaloids? And I'll quickly have a look at its effect in terms of as a supplement, as a legal high, and as a medicine. So we started in '95 with the field work. I had the first tablets made just of milled raw material, good quality raw material, '99. We set up a crazy company in the year 2000 where we made this Kanna and a few other plants from South Africa with 2 indigenous healers as co-directors, 2 academics. I mean, it was an impossible company to run, but at least we got some products out for the first time from indigenous South African plants. Finally, we got in 2010 standardized extract of Zembrin made available then to other companies to put just as an ingredient to put into their brands of tablets, etc. And in these yellow tablets contain 25 milligrams of Zembrin, and I was really thrilled. The South African National Defence Force, after the psychologists and psychiatrists played around with these tablets, have now put it on code. So for the last 3 years, the South African National Defence Force physicians, psychiatrists, and psychologists make this product available for reducing stress and anxiety in military personnel and the families of military personnel. So that was a real thrill. But better than that, I have to really thank, if I've got to thank anyone, I must thank Health Canada. They're the only regulatory authority in the world that formally accepted the science that we did, the quality, the whole issue, the safety studies, and they approved the 25 milligram dose of Zembrin under the Natural and Non-Prescription Health Products Directorate. So that was just a real fantastic thing. Here's an American company puts 25 milligrams of Zembrin into this product, which they called Anxious Less, and they reference the SAN and borrow this photo. This is my photograph that seems to have appeared everywhere to do with Kanna. But part of me is still a doctor or physician, and I must say, even though it frustrates me, I'm not at the botanical level with Zembrin. I love getting the anecdotes where people's lives improve from a supplement, and there's definitely a role for something like that. So listen to this. The biggest benefit for me is helping my tendency to unfounded excessive anxiety. I just wanted to let you know I took one of the tablets today, and wow, within an hour I felt focused and calm. And we often get that double signature reported to us, that you feel de-stressed, but you can function and go through the day. It seems very grounding. It makes me more sure of myself, significantly clearer mentally. I feel much, much calmer, and I'm not so emotional all the time. So these are really nice findings, and it's just hinting at what the potential of Zembrin, Kanna, mesembrine-alkaloids could do in terms of major depression, generalized anxiety disorder, etc. In terms of the future, I've absolutely no idea. I mean, what is going to be the impact on the entire CNS supplement and medical industry as all of these cannabinoids get more researched, etc. It's just opened up a fantastic field of exploration from a clinical research and health perspective point of view. What we realized in the early 90s when we were playing around with the Sceletium, the kind of raw material ourselves, is that if you took about 200 milligrams of milled raw material and rolled it into a joint with marijuana, it completely took off any type of an anxiety signature. And from those days, this type of aspect of Kanna has spilt into the general use around the world. And I'm waiting to see if people ever commercialize this in terms of all these legal states in the United States where you're going to start seeing the marriage of marijuana and Kanna. At the same time, the world's changing dramatically. I mean, if any of you are as old as me, you would have read a book in the 70s called Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. But future shocks now, there's such dramatic changes in the world, exponential changes, that Charles Schwab of the World Economic Forum has written a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, and that's where we are now. So at the same time, we're going to be able to monitor all sorts of aspects of our physiology and our mental states, and I think it's happening quite dramatically now with wearable tech and miniaturization. So are we going to be able to monitor ourselves and then take from a palette of different CNS active botanicals or extracts or compounds to modify this to meet our needs, or simply to cope with the dramatic pace of changes around us? I have no idea. Legal highs. That very first photograph you saw of the experimental plots of Sceletium from the early 90s. Well, I'm not embarrassed to say that about 40 kilograms of that material found its way to Omchi Herbs in Eugene, Oregon, run by John Winslow. Conscious Dreams, a smart shop in the Netherlands, and another company called Botanical Art in the Netherlands. And those three organizations actually spread Kanna out into the entheogenic community, to the research community, etc., making for the first time material widely available. I found that the South African trance community now uses Kanna. That's fine. The problem is we're starting to see the emergence of problems. People are now scrutinizing Kanna. There's papers coming out on how to analyze it from a forensic point of view. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime have listed it as a herb of concern. The metabolites have even been studied for future forensic use. And I was quite shocked to see a paper showing that Kanna was adulterated, bought from one of these online shops, and is now adulterated with ephedrine, obviously to give it the real high that it's missing from its natural chemistry. Amazon.com has listed Kanna as a prohibited herb under a list of botanicals, many of them, not Kanna alone, that they say have that mimic the actions of banned substances. And then I discovered Kanna in an undated Drug Enforcement Agency presentation. So obviously it's under scrutiny. And it doesn't help when you can go to Alibaba.com and get ridiculous extracts claiming to be Kanna. They may be 100-to-1 concentration. I mean, Zembrin is a 2-to-1 concentration. 2 kilos of raw material give you 1 kilo of extract. 100-to-1 concentration. And all of them touting exaggerated concentrations of mesembrine, which may actually be synthetic, who knows. But in parallel to this kind of bizarre situation that's unfolding, the e-vaping story is exploding around the world. And I found 2 patent applications by the multinational tobacco company Philip Morris on electronic vaporizers, the mechanism, etc., patented. But under the list of ingredients, they included mesembrine. So we might start seeing these isolated compounds appearing in vape mixtures. Okay. So the botanical medicine, we anticipate, this is my wife Olga, she's an integrative psychiatry in Cape Town. She doesn't treat all her patients with Zembrin, but she certainly treats some, and some specifically request to be treated with it. We wrote up the first clinical studies, case reports, not clinical studies, case reports on patients we'd seen, and we presented them in Australia in 2001, and they're written up in the Australian Journal of Medical Herbalism, all reporting anxiolytic and anti-anxiety activity, antidepressant activity in a very short time, within 1 or 2 days. So it's quite dramatic. And we got invited to write a chapter on Sceletium in a book that's coming out called Integrative Treatments in Psychiatric Practice. So we submitted the information, and lo and behold, one of the editors, Richard Brown, is an integrative psychiatry at Columbia University, inserted his own anecdotes. Unbeknown to us, he's been treating patients for the last 15 years, also with Sceletium, and saying he gets rapid improvements in anxiety and depression and the type of doses he's using. So supplement dose is in the region of about 1.4 to 2.8 milligrams of the alkaloids. But when you're treating generalized anxiety disorder or major depression, it's at least double and sometimes 4 times that. So in addition to anxiety and depression, we're also getting anecdotes coming in from various practitioners and from people useful in attention deficit disorder, PTSD, complex PTSD, mild cognitive impairment. We had one addiction center starting to use it, but I haven't had feedback on that, etc. And I had one patient who was actually a neighbor of mine. We had a very reclusive neighbor in an area I lived in Cape Town. The neighborhood know that I play with plants. And this guy came to see me, kept away from me most of the time, but he came to see me and he seemed extremely distraught and was chatting about plants and this and that. And I realized that basically he was having a major emotional crisis, but he's not the kind of person that you tell will go to the hospital, go and see a doctor. So I said to him, look, I've got these plants here and we've got some tablets of Sceletium, would you like to try them? He said fine, and he took them. I didn't see him for 4 weeks, and he walked past me in the road the one day and he said, Nigel, those tablets saved my sanity. He said I was having a complete psychotic breakdown. So it's the first clue we've got of an antipsychotic possibility for these compounds. And it fits in with rolipram actually is also being explored as an antipsychotic. So I guess I'm not going to go into the very obvious that there's obvious possibilities for the compounds to be seed molecules, pharmacophores for future drug discovery and development. But for me, the tragedy of the whole thing is that even these arid areas that are extremely biodiverse, the healers that know how to use these plants have died out. Okay, so there's Kabbo, died more than a century ago. Oom was literally the last healer from this entire flora that knows how to use it. The younger healer who was with him, Yap, unfortunately, in my estimation, it's just a completely different story. So the real healers that come from an enormous lineage no longer exist. And we're seeing this all over in southern Africa. We've got habitat destruction, we've got dramatic acculturation. If you go to these hamlets where I originally worked 20 years ago and you speak to young people, they're watching TV with satellite dishes. They're not remotely interested in working on medicinal plants or following this. So it's a dramatic loss of knowledge. So over 20 years, I mean, so many people have contributed to this project. I mean, I get to present it as if it's all my work, but so many people have contributed one way or another, and they're all here. And unfortunately, some of them have already passed away. So I'd like to pay tribute to everyone that's contributed. So thanks very much.